Hey everybody, I think I'm on tape 6 or 7 trying to create this video. I hope it works this time. If you're seeing me, then it did. I hope you guys are doing well and all staying safe. And so I want to just jump right into it here because this is running up so late. And there will be accommodations made with regards to the initial post since it is Friday. And I'm really trying to get this up and running. So this week, you've already started the 2 chapters this week on the late Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, as well as the rise of the Middle Ages and manorialism and feudalism, and then getting to the Crusades. So since I've done this so many times, I've had enough time to try and narrow this down so this is not a long drawn out video. Okay, but there's a lot of stuff to cover and a lot to unpack, and obviously we don't have enough time in this mini lecture to go over everything that's in Launchpad, but what I'm talking about today should complement what you're reading in Launchpad. So, the late Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, is an important part of history in that it really kind of sets the stage of the growth of Christianity in the Roman Empire, because it's when the Roman Empire, the capital of the Roman Empire, which is Rome to begin with, is moved eastward to Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, although maybe Constantinople today in modern-day Turkey. So why did they do that? Because this is a pretty big deal, and it is what leads to the decline in trade and in lifestyle, decrease in lifestyle and thought and knowledge in what is Western Europe and what becomes the Middle Ages. So now, when Rome, which was the capital of the Roman Empire, is moved to Constantinople, it really leaves a void in Italy, and it leads Italy and Rome to be very vulnerable to attacks, and it is attacked, and Rome is actually sacked, destroyed by the Visigoths and around the early 400s. So what is going on here? Why is that happening? Well, because it's left vulnerable. The wealth of that city is now diminished, and all the commerce and the trade that was coming in, while there's still commerce and trade, it is not at the same level as it was prior to the capital being moved. When the capital is moved, it's moved because there are more people in the eastern part of the Roman Empire than in the west. And so the emperor wants to address that and moves the capital east and creates and builds the city of Constantinople, which later becomes under Islamic rule, much later than we're talking now. But next week we will be getting into Islam and the rise of the Islamic states in Spain and in the Middle East and North Africa, and a real influence on the sub-Saharan trades. So in the meantime, though, here we are in Europe. So keep a couple things in mind. I want you to think long term and like, why are you learning this? Well, you're learning this because in the Mediterranean, around the Roman Empire, if you remember, goes all the way from Spain around into Gaul, which is modern day France, and into, obviously, Italy, to Greece, to what is modern day Turkey, going down through the Middle East, into Egypt, and all of North Africa. So it surrounds the Mediterranean. It also is going towards what is modern day India, and it when it does that, as the further east it goes, it is now incorporating and become part of the trade networks that had been in place for thousands of years, since the very earliest river civilizations. Very, very, very big deal, because the Roman Empire, also with Greece, Greece is part of, ancient Greece is also part of these vast, vast trade networks that had been in existence for couple thousand years. And they are super, super complex. They're monetary economies. They have insurance and insurance fraud. I mean, it's really rivals our own society now in so many ways. And a lot of times when we look back on this time period, we think, oh, it wasn't like, how do we identify, how do we connect with them? Well, it was actually very, very much like the world we live in now. So with regards to the complexity and the management of money and trade and what was being traded, silks and cottons and linens and spices and lions and tigers and bear, oh my! But anyway, I digress. Nevertheless, so they're tapping into these tremendous resources that have been in existence for a very, very long time. And in Europe, they're not really, they're Western Europe, Great Britain, France, Spain, which isn't Spain at the time, all these places, they've not really had an opportunity to tap into those trade routes and those, I want to say textiles and this merchandise. Really, I mean, they're just way out on the fringes, really, of the complexity that had been going on for so long. And the only way they were really connected to it was through the Roman Empire. When the Roman Empire expanded up into Great Britain, into Germany, Germania, that's my dog, and into Spain, what you got with the Romans was that connection to that trade. And so the world really was pretty advanced in lots of ways. Understanding of sciences, philosophy, science. From the Greeks, the Romans pick up on that. They become hydraulic masters. I mean, really, truly hydraulic masters. They understand, they need fresh water, the aqueducts. If you look at the engineering of aqueducts, it blow your mind. I mean, it's really crazy. They create new forms of ways to build, including the Roman arch, where it's the pressure of the bricks against each other that holds that arch in place, which goes to the dome, very Etruscan, and also concrete and new building materials that they create, and it builds out a world that people live in, where you have indoor plumbing in a house, you have hot and cold running water in a house, you have a separate place to use the bathroom and for waste. So it's really on everyday people's lives. People are bathing, people are wearing different clothes every day, just like we do. They're taking a bath every day, they're changing their clothes, they're using china and porcelain from China. They're using utensils to eat with. They're not like ours exactly, but the same kinds of concepts are there. And when we see the movement of the capital of Rome to Constantinople, slowly we see a decline of the Roman presence in Western Europe, the Roman influences in Western Europe. And as a response, as a consequence of this, is a couple of things. First is the rise of manorialism and feudalism, and also the rise of the church and the ability for the church to make law, canon law, that has to be followed by people. So a couple of things to unpack here is that, and I want you to think about this for the discussion board. Imagine, if you will, you've got a world where it is very much like ours, like, very complex. You have a lot of great technology for the time. Idea, like I say, of concrete and building materials and indoor plumbing and hot water and a bath. All these things are in existence in and around the Mediterranean and in places where the Roman Empire, the late Roman, the Byzantine Empire exists. All at the same time that in Western Europe you see this as the Roman influence abates and Western Europe loses those influences, then the communities in Western Europe, whether they be the Franks or the Brits or the Anglos, the Saxons, the Picts, the Celts, these folks are reverting back to a community-based way of living. But when the Romans came in and the Roman army came in, the generals, one of the ways that you got people to fight for you is that you gave them land and large swaths of land. And over a couple of generations that the Romans were there, so that those descendants of those early Roman generals and military folk ended up becoming lords of the land. How did that happen? Well, first of all, in order to get people to go so far away from home, which Great Britain was, you have to give them incentive. And so what is the incentive? Well, the incentive is land. And that was very typical for the Roman Empire and for so many armies in the ancient world. Remember, land equals wealth equals power. So they were given land. Okay, so now in the Roman system, there was something called a latifundia. And a latifundia was a large country estate. Well, that's basically what this latifundia turns into the manorial system. And so these people were given large land estates, country estates, and there are tons of acreage along with these estates. And they stayed there for a while, and over the generations, some of these younger generations the descendants never actually knew Rome, but they became lords of those estates. And then manorial system really has some similarities. It's a system, and Rome is very much a system-based community. I mean, the way that it is governed, there are systems in place in order for the community to be governed. And so the latifundia becomes the manor system, manorial system, and then you see the rise of feudalism, which, remember, from Shang China, there was feudalism, and feudalism is just relationship-based systems of governance, okay? And the peasants are at the bottom end of this. Now, that system rises up as the trade that came from being part of the Roman Empire decreases. And when it decreases, and we have a very community, a bubble in a community that is based off of this manorial system, and you see then who comes in, the church, people who are members of the church, because that's part of Christianity, is being a missionary to bring more converts into the religion. And as the remnants of the old Roman Empire leave Great Britain and Europe, what comes in its place kind of concurrently, and this is this doesn't happen overnight, but it's like a wave, one wave ebbing out, one wave coming in, and that is Christianity. And in Christianity, we have the Western Church that's going to be the primary dominating factor here, run by originally the Bishop of Rome, who becomes the Pope. So when these priests come into these communities, initially, they actually come in and try to use force to convert people into Christianity. Great. And that doesn't work, obviously. And so what they end up doing is deciding, well, if we can't beat them, we'll join them. And that's what you see throughout all of Christendom, where Christianity becomes tied in and synchronized with local rituals, pagan rituals. So one of those rituals, of course, is the Easter bunny, right? So, and Easter eggs and jelly beans, those things, what does that have to do with the resurrection? Well, when you go up into Europe and then you go into pagan Celts and Picts, you see that what do? They are celebrating the spring. And what happens in the spring? Well, the world wakes up again. It's like the world comes alive again. And so there's a lot of spring rituals that these pagan folks are following, which is actually true for all over the globe. Honestly, different things. The Passover is related to that. There's all kinds of stuff we can't really get into, but just understand that when you bring a new religion into an area, the people who are practicing their faith are not going to just suddenly go, oh, I'm not going to practice my faith. It's been in my family for generations and eons. They're going to, in order to really make people convert, you're going to have to find a way to mesh the two concepts. And so one of the things is that the rites of spring are morphed in and synchronized with the resurrection, because the resurrection, Jesus was dead and then he became alive. In the winter months, the world is dead, the Mother Earth is dead, and then in the spring, it reawakens, it becomes alive again. So there's some similarities with that. Now, so you see the rise of the church. Well, another piece of this is that when you see the rise of, the church is rising in power with converts, one of the things that is lost when the Romans leave and the influences of the Roman Empire are gone is that people revert intellectually. I mean, because there's no influx of new ideas and new concepts with trade. So they revert to the most basic, simple kinds of way of looking at the world. And so you see a decline in the way people live. People are not, their quality of life goes down. And as a person's quality of life goes down, then their suffering and their despair goes up. This is just normal human stuff. And so when the church comes in, another piece of this puzzle, this way to convert people is to say, look, I know your life is terrible right now. I know it pretty much sucks that, if you get a cut, you can die. Your teeth are rotting out. Life is tough. It truly is tough. And so here's the deal, guys. Because most of you guys are poor, the church says, being poor is godly. Okay, so that makes it okay to be poor. Because you're poor, your life sucks. And the church recognizes and acknowledges life sucks. And so, the church can't make your life any better, but what we can do is tell you that you're going to have a better life in the next one. So when you die, because people are seeing death all the way around them, and death is quite frightening, don't worry about this. When you die, you're going to have a better life after death. So, the next life is going to be a better life. Okay. So that makes people much more comfortable about dying, and it also makes them be able to deal a little bit better with the miserable existence they have. Because when I say miserable, I really mean, think about this. If you have a toothache, what do? You go to the dentist, or you take ibuprofen. But but these people don't have that. What about an earache? Have you guys ever had an earache? Oh my gosh, they're miserable. And there's nothing to take care of that. So, and when they're not bathing their bodies, because they think that if they bathe their bodies and it opens their skin to disease, they're really apt to get sick quickly. And they really don't understand. They've lost this knowledge and understanding of fresh water being important to live. And so the whole intellectual community of Europe begins a decline. So people go and they poop, they have their outhouses by the creek, and they poop and pee in the creek, and then it goes down the creek. Another person, a house down the creek, is using the creek water to drink. this is problematic, super problematic, right? We know that because it's germ theory. We understand this now. So people were dying and people's lives were really tough, and the church is able to make them feel better about how miserable life is right now, but also that it's okay. And God forbid anything happened to you, the next life is gonna be better. And so that makes everybody feel more comfortable. But also with more converts comes power. So we know people existed in the Middle Ages. We know it from many, many sources, right? However, the church eventually gets enough power to where if you are not a member of the church, then your existence no one may even know of your existence. How can that be? Well, it can be because the church kept records and recorded different time periods in your life. So how did they know, if you do ancestry, how do you know that you have ancestors? Well, where do you go? One of the places you go is church registries. Because if you were baptized, then that was put in the church registry, and usually, not always, would it say when you were born. Not always, but at least this is when you were baptized. When you were married, many times your marriage would be recorded because that's a sacrament. Dying, if you died and you had last rites, that would be recorded. That's a sacrament. So the church would keep track of that. If you were not a member of the church, then nobody, it very often happened that, you didn't exist on paper. So that was a very important part of the role of the church. Also, though, the church, the priests were the only ones who could read and write in this time period. Schools, the concepts of schools and education, philosophy that the Greeks started and the Romans picked up on, was not, with the loss of the influence of the Roman Empire, we have a loss of any kinds of ideas like that. And the church now becomes a power to control people as well. As long as the church is the one who reads and writes, it can control the kings even. And there were some Germanic Frankish, that's German, kings that didn't believe in being like, I'm a king, I don't have to read and write because I'm a king, and therefore the church is that's what they're there for. But then who has all the real power dynamic? I mean, really, it's the church. So the church really enjoys this power dynamic over time, and eventually, because they get so much power, we see the Reformation, Protestant Reformation, but that comes in a couple weeks. But in this time period that we're looking, the church is growing. Knowledge and information and ideas about the greater world are decreasing substantially. And people's quality of life has just gone down dramatically in what was the old Roman extensions of the old Roman Empire, from France up to Great Britain into Germany. So what does that mean? Everyday people's lives are just very, very basic. Housing becomes very, very basic. People live in huts, and they have dirt floors. They really only wear one or two clothes. That's all they have, pieces of clothing. They don't brush their teeth. They don't really wash their hair. This whole idea of bathing is completely lost. And nobody reads, which is totally counter to the concepts of education that come from Greece in what was the Roman Empire. So they lose so much stuff. And then with the rise of the church, they gain so much power to the point that, which we're not getting into Islam yet, although next week we are, but with Crusades, we are getting into the Crusades. There in around the 600s into the 700s, we see the beginning of Islam. And with Islam comes an expansion of Islam, and Islam comes out of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, and it goes into what is modern-day Israel, and into eventually Jerusalem. And at that point, this is where the priests and the church are like freaking out, and they're like, okay, we've got to retake Jerusalem. It's the Holy Land. we've got to retake it. Now, there's a whole lot more to unpack here, so please understand that. Please read your text to have a better understanding. These are cliff notes that I'm giving you. But the church ends up going into starts the first crusade in the 900s. So how did they get soldiers? Because in order to create a crusade, you just can't have, the lords and the knights. I mean, they're not going to be the ones who are fighting against these large Islamic armies. So what does the church do? Church goes out to the farmers and they entice them to join. Now, how do they entice them to join? They say, hey guys, if you're in debt at all to the Jewish people, the church is going to you don't have to pay any of that back. You're going to have a place in heaven. And they just get, and these farmers are like, yeah, count me in. And now why would these farmers be in debt? Well, the farmers would be in debt because even today, the American government subsidizes farms. So farming is really a very tough industry or business to be in. Because if you don't have a good yield one year, then how are you going to have the money in order to pay for the down season and have seeds to sow for the new season? And even, like I say, even now, this is problematic for family-run farms and even for some super large farms. But nevertheless, so where did they get money from? Because they'd have to borrow money. Well, the church, remember a moment ago, I said the church is saying to be poor is godly. So by default, the opposite of that is to have money is to be not godly. It's not a good thing. Well, why did the Jews have money? Because Jews just have money? No, not at all. So in the Middle Ages, as you see the rise of the church, you see the beginnings of real systematic anti-Semitism. Why do I say systematic anti-Semitism? Well, because from the very beginning of when you see the beginning of the rise of Christianity and the rise of what is now modern day rabbinical Judaism, they both come out of Jerusalem and out of Judea around the same time. And those early folks, they were Jewish, who were following Jesus because Jesus was Jewish. Now, the Romans played a big role in this because the Jews caused wars with Rome. Now, the first Jewish war with Rome, Meds and Meds, Rome still didn't outlaw them and still didn't have a big problem with them. But it was from that war that we see the beginnings of early Christianity and the early beginnings of what becomes rabbinical Judaism, modern day Judaism. And because after the Second War with Rome, Jewish war with Rome, the Romans were so angry with the Jews, they wanted the people who were Jewish, who were following Jesus, wanted to say, I'm not like those people. The other thing was, not only are we not like them, but we're not just Jewish anymore. We allow Gentiles in thanks to Paul. So Christianity was growing in a totally different place than Judaism was growing. So eventually over time, there is a growing distinction between who the Christians are and who the Jews are. And the narrative becomes, in order to be different from these other folks, the Jews are the people who killed Jesus. So they've committed deicide. Big deal. They've committed deicide. They've killed God. That's what deicide is. They've killed God. And so with the rise of the church, as I mentioned before, becomes canon law. This is laws that people live by. They're religious laws. Nowadays we talk about Sharia law. Oh, we don't want to be under Sharia law. Well, Middle Ages, people were living under canon law. Only Charlemagne was able to really nip them in the bud like whack-a-mole every time the church law tried to come up, rear its head, I'd say ugly head, because it was really difficult. It was not nice to people. It wasn't a kindness, like you couldn't even eat with people who were different than you. It was just really. So, like whack-a-mole, the church would come up, boom. That's what Charlemagne would do. But after his death, nah. So the church grew in power, and so the canon law, the religious law, also grew as well. And so canon law defined what people could do, really, as in livelihood. And it said people who are Jewish cannot own land, so they couldn't be farmers. People who are Jewish can't be cobblers, and they can't be blacksmiths, and they can't be wheelwrights, and they can't be bakers. And why? In order to be a craftsperson, you had to join a guild, like a union. And in order to join that guild, you had to take an oath of allegiance to that guild. And that oath of allegiance usually starts with, by my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Boom. You can't, a Jewish person obviously can't say that because that's not what they believe. So by default, they're left out of all the regular kinds of jobs. And what are they left with? They're becoming merchants. They have to be merchants, and most of them are traveling merchants. Well, when you are a traveling merchant, or when you're a merchant, there's some barter with goods and stuff, but there's a lot of real money, coin, that's being transferred back and forth between people. And so by default, Jewish people had coin in their possession. And the church said, yeah, if you want to lend money, you go over to the Jews because they're unclean, they're not godly, and they're playing with money which is not clean. And so, and they call those usury, which is lending. And almost everybody needed money across the board simply because of the nature of farming. I mean, it wasn't because anybody was bad or didn't do what they were supposed to do, or one was trying to cheat the other. None of this stuff. The all that. It was really just about, maintaining your life, and it was a rough life. So when the church came around to the Crusaders and said, "Hey, look, here's what we're going to do for you. We're going to wipe out your debt." They were like, "Hey, count me in." And did they really pay the Jews back? No, absolutely not. But nevertheless, it was a way to get people to join the crusading army. Now, once the crusading army whoever actually made it down to Jerusalem, which they were walking, and this is a long schlep, as they say, and a lot of people died along the way. There's a lot of problems with this whole dynamic. But by the time those who did actually get to Jerusalem, they were blown away. I mean, really, I cannot emphasize this enough, because they're going from living in a mud hut with their animals with them, not bathing, not brushing teeth, people dying very young, to Tomorrowland. I mean, this place was amazing because it was still part of those very, very extensive and old trade routes. So all different kinds of people, all different kinds of textiles, all different kinds of spices for food. People lived in beautiful homes with water, fresh water. People bathed every day. People wore lots of different kinds of clothing every day. I mean, it blew their mind. And some people said, "I'm never going back." And so they stayed. And to this day, there are some people in the Middle East, in Lebanon and Israel and a lot of places in the Middle East, Jordan, who have their history is European more than it is Semitic, which is Middle Eastern. So they stayed. And then those who decided to go back went back with goods. And they slowly began to bring these goods from these long extending trade networks back into Europe. But that was also a slog. That took forever to get back in there, and they could only bring so much stuff at a time. And the initial way they would sell their stuff would be through like flea markets, and those flea markets eventually became little villages, which eventually became towns, which eventually became cities. And now, what do? You got the manorial system where the land is owned by the lord and the manor. How is the church going to handle this? How is the land going to be divided up in the city? I mean, even to this day, although actually in 2020 in Great Britain you don't see it quite as much, but if you watch Downton Abbey, you would see that the town that was next to the manor, that's a really great example of the manorial system. If you watch that, Ivanhoe is a super great movie with regards to the Jews, the way that they used money and the way the Christians taught is very, very realistic. You can read the book or you can watch a movie. And then there's also another show which really, really I like, and it's on Netflix, called The Physician. And that is really, really great. It shows the difference between what was going on in Great Britain and in Europe with regards to knowledge of medicine and the lack thereof, but then going down into the Middle East, and you have schools that our Jewish and Muslim people could go to and be part of. So, and it really is a good view of all this, of the way the Middle East looked at Christians as, very similar kind of as the way Christians kind of looked at Jews. Very interesting observations to be made there. Nevertheless, slowly they begin, these merchants begin to bring back these goods. And like I say, we see the rise of towns at around 1100. Now, when the rise of towns come in, the church initially, thought, to be poor was godly and all this. But now the church sees a way that if the quality of life of people begin to go up because there's more trade, which means there's more wealth, now they see, we could benefit from this as well. And so they change the way they see things. And who knows how to use money? Who knows how to manage money? Well, the Jewish population know how to manage money. And so a lot of towns in Germany and Great Britain, they say, hey, and France, come on, hey, Jews, would you help us out? And so the Jews are like, okay, they see this as an opportunity for people to get to know them better. And they train these new civilian city managers on how to manage money. And once they learn how to do it, what do? They go, see you later, bye, Jews. We don't want you anymore. And they push them out on this edge of town in what becomes the very first ghettos. The very first ghettos. So it's really interesting how the words, some of the language you use or was used back then, we still use today. And they mean the same thing. So now the question that I have for you is, I want you to think about this. Look at when we talk in this little lecture, I've talked about how the Roman Empire their influences of the Roman Empire went all the way up into Great Britain, into France, into Germania. And with that came great understanding of many larger concepts, people reading, people writing. Charlemagne is part of this. He believes in education. He creates a first university in Aachen, Germany in the late 700s. So, very much influenced by larger ideas of concepts. He's a very, very intelligent man. He had a very diverse court, Jews, Christians, Muslims in his court. But once he dies and his sons take over, and then eventually his grandson, Louis the Pious, who starts the First Crusade, we see the kingdom breaking up. And now with the kingdom breaking up, now the kingdoms, there are three, they become very vulnerable to new, because it's chaos. And with chaos comes vulnerability. Well, and who rises up to fill that void? Well, the church does. But in the process of the church doing that, knowledge, information is lost. Now, I'm not saying the church is all bad or anything, but what I'm saying is you have to look at this from a historical perspective, not your own belief in Christianity. You have to look at this from a historical perspective, which leads us to this discussion board question. How do people lose knowledge? How do, I don't know if lose knowledge is the right way. How do we dismiss knowledge? How do we not make ourselves aware of knowledge? How do we live in a bubble? There's lots of answers to this, okay? This is a big question. But when Great Britain and Europe were influenced by Rome, those influences, those trade items, they came into Great Britain, into Western Europe. But when those ebbed out of Great Britain and into Western Europe, what also seemed to ebb out of that is information, like and desires for information, a desire to read and write, the desire to understand the world around, the understanding of bathing and just physical hygiene, medicine, ideas of medicine, which were very much a big, there's a lot. Aristotle was wrong on a lot of stuff, but there's still a lot of information on medicine in the time period that we're talking in what was remaining of the Byzantine and, influences of the Roman Empire, that when Islam came in, they just said, "Ooh, look at this. I love this. I'm going to absorb this. I'm going to take this in, and then I'm going to think about it, and I'm going to advance it," which is what they did with science and medicine. Very much what they did. But the Christians didn't do that in Western Europe. Why? And then by the same token, I want you to think now, this moment, I want you to connect that to this moment. Why, when we understand germ theory, for instance, we understand germ theory. We have scientists all over the globe working on this pandemic, and we understand germ theory. The scientists, it's irrefutable facts. The scientists know that if you wash your hands, or that this virus is held together by fats. Well, what destroys fats? Soap. So if you wash your hands, and then we also know that it comes in forms of when you're talking. Well, so you wear a mask. And if two people are wearing masks and they're staying socially distant, the chances are that the virus is not going to, you're not going to get infected. These are some real basic ideas, okay? Super, super basic ideas. And where do we get them from? Knowledge, science, understand, this is what education, this is where we are, 2020. Everybody expects it. We should know this stuff by now, right? And yet, look at the last 3 days in the United States. Look at the maps. Look at the coronavirus maps. Look at the coronavirus maps around the world. The United States has the highest. Why is that? Now, I'm not saying that everybody in America is, an idiot. There are a lot more people in America than in other parts of the world. But why, also in America, sometimes because we have freedom of speech, because we have freedom of religion, which are good things, and other countries actually do too now, how is the argument made that if I have to wear a mask, my freedom and my liberty is being obstructed? How does that go? Do you wear shoes into a restaurant? Why do you wear shoes into a restaurant? There are these arguments that are being made that are making, eventually, it can make people sick, even though we understand germ theory. Why is that happening? Why do we not acknowledge what we know and instead slide backwards? When we look at the Middle Ages, one of the things we do know is that part of the reason there's a slide backwards with knowledge and understanding is because the people who influenced and who brought new ideas and concepts into Western Europe were gone. But it took forever. It really did. It took forever for medicine to get caught up in Western Europe. It took forever for medicine to get caught up in Western Europe as opposed to the Middle East. Islam in Baghdad was the very first city that had a real hospital. I mean, like a hospital, like for people. And yet we could have done that in Europe. Why didn't that happen? So how do people go? How do you know, how does it happen? How does it happen that we revert to our emotional wants and not address our intellectual, our intellect? How do we rationalize away our intellect? The Middle Ages in Western Europe, people lost a lot of information, a lot of time. But are we doing that now? Can you see any similarities in this? Can you see where we are living in Tomorrowland, but yet we still seem to backtrack? The bubonic plague, say that 5 times fast, it was a pandemic. People didn't know germ theory. 1/3 of the population died. One of the statistics or studies that I've seen so far, it says that between 6 and 23% of Americans have been infected by COVID. Well, that's 33% is 1/3. And all I'm saying is people didn't know of germ theory back then. We know of it now. Why should we have the same result? What is it that rationalizes away intellect? And why would you not want to learn? What would be the reasons why you wouldn't want to try and expand your knowledge? Or why do you think a group of people like the church didn't want others to read and write and that's what they didn't want. That's why we have the Protestant Reformation eventually. So what's power have to do with this? It's a big question. I hope this makes sense. If it doesn't, let me know. But what it basically is that in history, we see ebbs and flows of knowledge, the loss of knowledge, the regaining of knowledge. Why does it happen? And are we going through the same thing right now? Or does it appear like we're going through the same thing right now? Maybe we're not. But to me, there's a feeling that there's something similar. What are your thoughts on that? Let me know. So here's the deal. I'm going to email this announcement out if this one takes. Your initial response date does not have to be tomorrow. From here up until Tuesday, you need to respond to 2 other classmates for the full 40 points. But I am waiving the Saturday initial post date. Okay? All right, guys. Mwah! Have a great weekend, and I hope this takes, please. Be safe. Make safe choices. Bye.